In the early morning hours of January 28, 1977, in room 25 of the Beverly Comstock Hotel, Freddie Prinze performed his final act. But the only audience member didn't laugh. Instead, they screamed in horror. In front of his manager, Dusty Snyder, the golden boy of American comedy, calmly placed a gun to his temple, uttered a chilling line, "It's all over," and pulled the trigger with the cold precision of a killer. It was a suicide staged like a dark play, where the line between a bizarre joke and permanent death blurred in an instant. Tragically, this insane act didn't stem from a moment of impulse, but was the result of a brain completely ravaged by the cruel chemical cycle of success. At 22, Freddie was a millionaire, but to keep millions smiling, he had to use cocaine to explode on stage and gulp down dozens of Quaaludes to find sleep. The Hollywood money-making machine drained the young genius, transforming him from a shining star into a desperate addict, choosing death as the only escape from the immense pressure. But the trajectory of that fatal bullet didn't begin in a Hollywood hotel room. It started 22 years earlier in the sweltering streets of Washington Heights, New York, a neighborhood defined by the uneasy collision of Jewish refugees and Puerto Rican migrants. Into this friction, Frederick Carl Prutzel was born on June 22, 1954. He was a biological contradiction. His father, Edward Prutzel, was a Hungarian Jew, a tool and die maker who carried the quiet trauma of his heritage. His mother, Maria Graniella, was a fierce, devout Puerto Rican Catholic. Freddie was the physical manifestation of a cultural clash. He did not look like his father. He did not look entirely like his mother. He was something new, something undefined. He was, as he would later coin the term, a Hungarican. The apartment they lived in was small. The walls were thin. The dynamic inside the Prutzel household was intense. Edward was the silent partner. He worked hard. He kept his head down. He was a man of the 1950s, distant, providing, stoic. Maria was the storm. She was not just a mother. She was an architect. She looked at her son, and she did not see a baby. She saw a savior. She saw a destiny. From the moment he drew breath, Maria poured a suffocating, terrifying love into him. She called him her Pranzel. She told him he was special. She told him he was better than the other children on the street. She told him he was destined for greatness. This is a dangerous thing to tell a child. It creates a reality distortion field. Inside the apartment, Freddie was a prince. Outside on the street, he was prey. Washington Heights in the late 1950s and early 60s was not a place for the sensitive. It was a place for the tough. Freddie was not tough. He was soft, he was asthmatic, and he was fat. By the time he was in elementary school, Freddie weighed significantly more than his peers. His weight became his defining characteristic. He couldn't run, he couldn't fight, he couldn't hide. He was a visible target. The bullying was relentless. It was physical and it was verbal. The Puerto Rican kids mocked him for being Jewish. They called him names that attacked his heritage. The Jewish kids rejected him for being Puerto Rican. He was too dark for one group, too mixed for the other. He belonged nowhere. He would walk home from school, clutching his books, scanning the alleys for threats. He learned the geography of escape. He knew which blocks to avoid. He knew which stairwells offered safety. But he couldn't run forever. One afternoon, cornered in a school bathroom facing a group of boys who intended to hurt him, Freddie discovered a weapon. It wasn't a knife, it wasn't a fist, it was a voice. He cracked a joke. It was likely self-deprecating. It was likely about his weight or his mother or the absurdity of the situation. The boys stopped. They laughed. The tension broke. Freddie realized in that moment that laughter was a currency. It could buy him safety. It could buy him time. He began to cultivate this skill with the obsession of a scientist. He studied people. He listened to the accents in his building. He listened to the Jewish grandmothers complaining about the heat. He listened to the Puerto Rican superintendents yelling in the hallway. He learned to mimic them. He learned to inhabit them. The bathroom at school became his theater. During breaks, Freddie would hold court. He would stand by the sinks, the smell of disinfectant in the air, and perform. He would do 10 minutes on the teachers. He would do 10 minutes on the neighborhood. The bullies who used to chase him now stood in a semicircle, laughing. He was no longer the fat victim. He was the funny guy. But the laughter didn't fix the loneliness. It just masked it. When the bell rang and the audience dispersed, he was still Frederick Prinze. He was still the boy who went home to a mother who watched his every move. Maria's control was absolute. She monitored his diet, though his weight fluctuated. She monitored his friends. She didn't want him associating with the street element. She wanted him to be refined. She wanted him to be a star. She enrolled him in ballet classes. For a heavy-set boy in a rough neighborhood, this was a social death sentence, but he obeyed. He learned to move. He learned grace. He learned to perform for her approval. His father, Edward, watched this with growing concern. He wanted his son to have a trade. He wanted him to have stability. He saw the entertainment world as a pipe dream, a dangerous gamble. He wanted Freddie to finish school. He wanted him to be normal. But normal was not an option. Maria had already decided. Freddie was accepted into the High School of Performing Arts, the Fame School. It was a validation. It meant he had talent that the establishment recognized. He took the subway down to Midtown every day. He was surrounded by dancers, actors, musicians. He should have flourished. But Freddie was impatient. He was bored by the theory. He was bored by the slow pace of academic validation. He knew he could make people laugh now. He didn't want to wait for a diploma. He began sneaking out at night. He lied about his age. He went to the comedy clubs in Greenwich Village, the Improv, Catch a Rising Star. These were smoke-filled basements where the future of American comedy was being written. He watched the comics. He saw the rhythm. He saw the power. A man with a microphone could control a room of 200 drunks. A man with a microphone was a king. He started getting stage time. He was barely 16, 17 years old. He went up on stage. He was terrified. He was sweating. But when he grabbed the mic, something happened. The persona took over. He didn't tell jokes like the old Borscht Belt comics. He didn't do "Take my wife, please." He talked about his life. He talked about Washington Heights. He talked about the cockroaches in his apartment. He talked about his mother. "My mother is crazy," he would say. "I'm part Puerto Rican, part Jewish. If I can't buy something wholesale, I steal it." The audience roared. It was fresh. It was raw. It was the first time they had heard the Latino experience articulated with such sharp, biting wit. He wasn't playing the fool. He was playing the observer. He dropped out of high school in his senior year. It was a declaration of war against his father's wishes. Edward was furious. He saw his son throwing away his future. Maria was ecstatic. She saw her son stepping into his destiny. The friction in the Prinze household increased. Freddie was torn. He loved his father, but he was addicted to the stage. He needed the applause. It was the only time he felt real. He began working the circuit. The life was grinding. Late nights, cheap food, subways at 2 a.m., but he was getting better. He was honing the act. He created a character, the Chico persona. It was a streetwise kid, sharp, fast, uneducated, but brilliant. It was a version of himself, but armored. By 1973, he was making a name for himself. The buzz was building. People in the industry started talking about the kid from New York. He was 19. He was still living with his parents. He was still a child in the eyes of the law. but on stage he was a giant. He was looking for the big break. In the 1970s, there was only one door to the kingdom. If you wanted to be a star, you had to go through it. The door was located in Burbank, California. The gatekeeper was a man named Johnny Carson. Freddie set his sights on The Tonight Show. It was the Holy Grail. Comics spent 20 years trying to get 5 minutes on that stage. Freddie decided he would do it in one. He auditioned. The talent scouts were skeptical. He was young. He was ethnic. His material was specific to New York. Would it play in the Midwest? Would it play in the suburbs? Freddie didn't care. He knew he was funny. He knew he had the it factor. The call came. He was booked. December 6, 1973. Freddie packed his bags. He told his mother. She cried. She prayed. She told him this was it. This was the moment she had engineered since he was in the cradle. He flew to Los Angeles. He arrived in a city that felt like a different planet compared to Washington Heights. It was wide open. It was sunny. It was rich. He went to the NBC studios. He walked onto the set. The curtain was multicolored. The band was loud. The audience was packed. He waited in the green room. He paced. He smoked. He adjusted his tie. He checked his mustache in the mirror. He looked at the boy staring back at him. He saw Freddie Prinze, the fat kid who hid in the bathroom. He pushed that boy down. He summoned Freddie Prinze. The stage manager called his name. Our next guest is a young comedian from New York. Please welcome Freddie Prinze. The curtain parted. The light hit him. It was blinding. He walked out. He hit his mark. He took the microphone. He looked at the camera. He looked at the audience. He smiled. For the next 6 minutes, he didn't just tell jokes. He destroyed the room. He owned every second. His timing was impeccable. His energy was infectious. The audience wasn't just laughing. They were applauding in the middle of the set. He finished his routine. He took a bow. The applause was deafening. Then the moment happened. The moment that changed history. The moment that signed his death warrant. Johnny Carson, the kingmaker, the man who could make or break a career with a glance, clapped. He looked at Freddie, and then he waved his hand. He invited Freddie to the couch. It was unheard of. A young comic on his first appearance, getting called to the couch. It was the ultimate seal of approval. It meant you were not just a guest, you were a peer. Freddie walked over. He sat down. He wasn't shaking. He leaned back. He lit a cigarette. He bantered with Carson. He looked like he had been sitting in that chair for 10 years. In that 10-minute span, Freddie Prinze ceased to exist. He was gone. In his place was a commodity, a star, a product. When he walked off the stage that night, agents were waiting. Managers were waiting. The network executives were waiting. They saw dollar signs. They saw a demographic they hadn't tapped. They saw a handsome, funny, ethnic kid who could sell soap and cars and laughter. They didn't see the 19-year-old boy who still lived with his mother. They didn't see the asthma. They didn't see the deep, crushing insecurity. They just saw the light, and like moths, they swarmed. Freddie called home. He told Maria, "I did it, Ma. I sat on the couch." Maria wept. Her prophecy had come true. Her son was the chosen one. But prophecies have a way of demanding a sacrifice. The ascent had begun. The rocket was fueled. Freddie Prinze was strapped in. He was going to the moon. He didn't know that the rocket had no landing gear. He didn't know that the atmosphere up there was too thin to breathe. He just knew that everyone was clapping. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel fat, and he didn't feel poor. He felt loved. And that feeling was the most dangerous drug of all. December 1973, Burbank, California. The red light on the television camera faded, but the heat on Freddie Prinze was just beginning. He stepped off the stage of The Tonight Show and walked directly into the machinery of American capitalism. The hallway behind the curtain was crowded with men in suits, agents, managers, network executives. They smelled blood in the water and they liked the scent. In the entertainment industry, there is a specific vibration that surrounds a breakout star. It is a mix of greed and panic. Everyone wants a piece and everyone is terrified they will miss out. Freddie Prinze was 19 years old. He had no lawyer. He had no experience reading contracts. He stood there, the adrenaline of the performance still shaking his hands, while grown men promised him the world. NBC moved the fastest. The network was in a ratings war. They needed a weapon to fight CBS and ABC. They saw Freddie not as a comedian, but as a demographic key. He was young. He was ethnic. He was urban. He unlocked an audience that advertisers were desperate to reach. They offered him a holding deal. It was a standard practice. Pay the talent to sit still while the network finds a vehicle. But they didn't want him to sit still. They wanted him on air immediately. The project was Chico and the Man. The concept had been floating around the development offices for months. It was created by James Comack, a producer with a sharp eye for talent and a ruthless approach to production. Comack had originally envisioned the show for the comedy duo Cheech and Chong. He wanted a culture clash sitcom set in a failing garage in East Los Angeles. Cheech and Chong passed. They didn't want to be sanitized for prime time. Comack needed a Chico. He saw Freddie's set on Carson. He saw the charisma. He saw the way the audience leaned in when Freddie spoke. Comack realized he didn't need a counterculture stoner. He needed a lovable hustler. He needed Freddie Prinze. The deal was signed. The money was abstract to Freddie. It was numbers on a page. He was still thinking in terms of subway tokens and slices of pizza. The contract made him an employee of the Comack Company and NBC. He was the asset. They owned his face, his voice, and his time. Production began in 1974. The casting of the Man was crucial. They needed an anchor, someone to ground Freddie's frantic energy. They hired Jack Albertson. Jack Albertson was Hollywood royalty in the working class sense. He was 67 years old. He had come up through vaudeville and burlesque. He was a song and dance man, a dramatic actor, an Oscar winner. He was disciplined. He knew where the light was. He knew how to deliver a line with surgical precision. The dynamic on set was a collision of eras. Albertson was the old guard. Show up on time, know your lines, hit your mark. Freddie was the new wave. Improvisational, messy, fueled by nervous energy. Albertson watched the 19-year-old with a mixture of affection and concern. He saw the talent, but he also saw the lack of foundation. Freddie didn't have the technique to fall back on when the energy ran out. He was running on pure instinct. The pilot was taped in front of a live studio audience. This was the test. A sitcom lives or dies by the laughter in the room. If the machines have to sweeten the audio too much, the show is dead. Freddie walked onto the set of the garage. He wore a denim hat and a vest. He looked into the camera. He delivered his catchphrase. Looking good. It wasn't a joke. It was an attitude. It was a declaration of survival in a grim world. The audience erupted. They didn't just laugh, they cheered. They fell in love with Chico Rodriguez instantly. He was the underdog. He was the kid trying to make good in a world run by grumpy old men. The show premiered on September 13th, 1974. The reaction was nuclear. The ratings were unprecedented. Chico and the Man shot into the top 10. It stayed there. Within a month, Freddie Prinze was the most famous television star in the United States. Fame is a physical force. It changes the atmosphere around a person. Freddie could no longer walk down the street. He couldn't go to a restaurant. If he stepped outside, people swarmed him. They grabbed his clothes. They screamed his catchphrase in his face. "Looking good, Freddie, looking good." He smiled. He signed the autographs. He played the part. But inside, the disorientation was setting in. He had skipped the developmental steps of adulthood. He went from being a bullied kid in Washington Heights to a national icon in 12 months. There was no transition period. There was no time to adjust. The money started to hit his bank account. It was an avalanche. He was making thousands of dollars a week, then tens of thousands. The checks were tangible proof that he had won. He spent it with the manic intensity of someone who fears it will vanish. He bought a car, not a sensible sedan. He bought a 1975 Corvette Stingray, black, fast. He drove it through the Hollywood Hills at terrifying speeds. He collected traffic tickets like trading cards. The police would pull him over, see who it was, laugh, and let him go. He learned that the laws of traffic didn't apply to Chico. He bought a house, a sprawling property in the hills. It had a view of the city he had conquered. It had a pool. It had empty rooms that needed to be filled. He moved his parents out from New York. This was the dream. This was the promise he had made to Maria. I will make you rich. He flew them first class. He installed them in the house. The dynamic shifted violently. In New York, Edward and Maria were the parents, the authority figures. In Los Angeles, they were dependents. They lived in Freddie's house. They ate Freddie's food. They spent Freddie's money. The father, Edward, shrank in this new environment. He had no job, no purpose. He sat by the pool, a stranger in paradise. Maria, however, expanded. She took over the house. She managed the staff. She cooked the meals. She remained the gatekeeper. But now she was guarding a king. Her obsession with Freddie deepened. She told him he was too good for the people around him. She criticized his friends. She criticized his girlfriends. She whispered in his ear that everyone wanted his money. She was right, of course. Everyone did want his money, but hearing it constantly fueled Freddie's paranoia. The pressure of the show was relentless. A network sitcom in the 70s was a factory. They produced 22 episodes a season. The schedule was brutal. Monday table read, Tuesday rehearsal, Wednesday rehearsal, Thursday blocking, Friday taping. Freddie had to be funny on command. He had to be up all day. He had to memorize pages of dialogue. He had to deal with the network notes, the censorship standards, the press interviews. He began to feel the drain. He was tired. Not just physical fatigue, but a deep marrow-level exhaustion. He was giving pieces of himself to 40 million people every week, and he didn't know how to recharge. This is where the drugs ceased to be recreational and became structural. In the clubs of New York, drugs were part of the scene. A little coke to stay awake, a joint to relax. But in Hollywood, facing a grueling production schedule, drugs became a tool of the trade. Freddie discovered cocaine was the perfect fuel for television. It made him sharp. It made him fast. It killed his appetite, keeping him thin for the cameras. It banished the doubt. One line and he was Chico. One line and he was the king of the world. He started using in the morning. A bump to get out of bed, a bump before the table read, a bump before the taping. The producers saw the energy. They saw the mania. They didn't ask questions. As long as he hit his marks, as long as the ratings were high, the method didn't matter. But cocaine has a cost. The crash, the come down. At night, after the adrenaline of the taping faded, Freddie would be left shaking, his heart racing, his mind looping on dark thoughts. He couldn't sleep. He would pace the hallways of his big empty house, a loaded gun in his hand staring at the shadows. He needed a way to come down. He found Quaaludes, methaqualone, the disco biscuit. It was a heavy sedative. It shut the brain down. It turned the muscles to jelly. It provided a chemically induced oblivion. Freddie began to cycle, coke to go up, Quaaludes to go down. He was manipulating his own biology, forcing his body to operate outside of natural rhythms. He He was 20 years old, and he was running his engine at maximum RPM with no oil. The identity crisis worsened. The Latino community had embraced him, but there was a backlash. Activists criticized Chico and the man. They said the character of Chico was a stereotype. They said he was a buffoon. They said Freddie Prinze, a Hungarian Puerto Rican who spoke no Spanish in real life, was a fraud. Freddie took these criticisms personally. He wanted to be a hero. He wanted to be the brown hope. To be called a sellout hurt him deeply. He tried to defend the character. He argued that Chico was smart, that he always outwitted the white boss. But the doubt lingered. Who was he? Was he Freddie Prinze, the star? Was he Frederick Prutzel, the asthmatic kid? Or was he Chico, a fictional character written by white writers? He began to blur the lines. He started acting like Chico in real life. He adopted the swagger. He adopted the street slang. He was playing a role 24 hours a day because the real Freddie was too painful to inhabit. He surrounded himself with an entourage, bodyguards, hangers-on, friends from the old neighborhood who needed a paycheck. He paid for everything: dinners, trips, clothes. He wanted to be the generous leader, the padrino. He wanted to buy loyalty, but bought loyalty is fragile. The entourage laughed at his jokes because he signed the checks. They agreed with his paranoia because it kept the party going. They supplied the drugs because that was their function. They were an insulation layer, keeping reality away from the star. One of his diversions was firearms. It started as a hobby. He went to the range. He liked the focus required to shoot. It quieted his mind, but it grew into a fetish. He bought more guns, handguns, rifles. He kept them loaded around the house. He started playing games. He would pull a gun on a friend as a joke. He would wave it around while high. He liked the fear it inspired. It made him feel powerful. It was a compensation for the helplessness he felt inside the NBC machine. In 1975, the cracks in the facade were becoming visible to those close to him. Jack Albertson noticed. He tried to talk to Freddie. He tried to be a father figure. "You're burning the candle at both ends, kid," Albertson would say. Freddie would laugh. "I got a lot of candle, Jack." But he didn't. He was burning up. He tried to diversify. He released a comedy album, Looking Good. It sold well. He starred in a TV movie, The $1 Million Ripoff. He wanted to prove he could act. He wanted to be Al Pacino. He wanted respect. But Hollywood only wanted Chico. They wanted the catchphrase. They wanted the smile. The isolation grew. He had millions of fans, but he felt utterly alone. He couldn't talk to his parents. They depended on him. He couldn't talk to his employees. They worked for him. He couldn't talk to the network. He was a product to them. He sat in his mansion, the curtains drawn, watching cartoons, cleaning his guns, and waiting for the next taping. The boy from Washington Heights had achieved the American dream, and he found it was a solitary confinement cell with a swimming pool. He needed an escape. He needed something real. He looked for it in women. He dated actresses. He dated models, but he didn't trust them. He heard his mother's voice in his head. They only want your money. Then he met Catherine Cochran, Kathy. She wasn't famous. She wasn't an actress. She was a girl from a normal family. She worked as a cocktail waitress in Las Vegas. Freddie met her while touring. He saw something in her that he had lost: normality. He pursued her with the same intensity he applied to his career. He courted her. He charmed her. He wanted to possess her. He believed that if he could marry a normal girl, he could become a normal man. He could anchor himself. They married in October 1975. It was a whirlwind. Freddie was 21. Kathy was 25. He thought marriage would fix him. He thought it would silence the noise in his head. But you cannot fix a chemical imbalance with a wedding ring. You cannot cure a deep-seated trauma with a marriage license. He brought Kathy into his fortress, but he didn't change the locks. The drugs were still there, the guns were still there, and Maria was still there. The stage was set for a domestic war. Freddie was the prize, and he was tearing himself apart to keep everyone happy while his own soul slowly leaked out. The golden fever had burned away the innocence. Now the sickness was setting in. The second season of Chico and the Man began taping. The ratings were still high. The money was still flowing. But Freddie's eyes were changing. The spark was dimming. The laughter was becoming mechanical. He was a young man standing on top of a mountain of gold, realizing that he couldn't breathe the air. And in his pocket, he carried a coin. He would flip it. Heads, he lives. Tails, he dies. He was beginning to hope for tails. By 1975, the chemical regimen had hardened from a habit into a prison. His body had lost the ability to regulate itself, leaving him a hollow shell, shaking, terrified, and unable to function without his fix. The domestic sphere, which Freddie had hoped would be a sanctuary, became a war zone. His marriage to Catherine Cochran was meant to anchor him. Instead, it became the stage for a power struggle between the two women who claimed ownership of his soul, his wife and his mother. Maria Prutzel had not relinquished her control. She lived in the house. She viewed Kathy not as a daughter-in-law, but as an interloper, an employee who was failing at her job. Maria whispered in Freddie's ear. She played on his paranoia. She told him Kathy was spending too much money. She told him Kathy didn't understand him. She told him that only a mother's love was unconditional. Freddie, his mind warped by chemicals, listened. The cocaine made him suspicious. The Quaaludes made him irrational. He began to see enemies inside his own home. The arguments with Kathy were terrifying. They weren't normal marital spats. They were psychotic breaks. Freddie would rage. He would scream that she was using him. He would disappear for days, staying in hotels, staying with enablers, leaving his pregnant wife alone in the mansion with his mother. When he was home, the presence of firearms added a lethal potential to every disagreement. Freddie's fascination with guns had mutated into an obsession. He didn't just own them, he wore them. He walked around the house with a pistol tucked into his waistband. He cleaned them while watching television. There is a specific incident that illustrates the depth of the danger. During an argument, Freddie pulled a gun. He didn't fire it. He didn't have to. The threat was the weapon. He waved it. He used it to end the conversation. This is the behavior of a gangster, not a sitcom star. But in Freddie's mind, the lines had blurred. He was living in a movie where he was the tragic hero, and tragic heroes carry guns. Kathy was terrified. She was young, she was pregnant, and she was trapped in a house with a man who was systematically destroying his mind. She looked for allies, but she found few. The entourage that surrounded Freddie was on the payroll. They saw the guns, they saw the drugs, and they looked away. Their job was to say, "Yes, Freddie." To say no was to be fired. The medical profession, which should have been the line of defense, was instead the supplier. In 1970s Los Angeles, there existed a class of physicians known as Dr. Feelgoods. These were licensed doctors who understood the unique needs of the celebrity class. They understood that a star couldn't go to a street corner to buy drugs. It was too dangerous. It was bad for PR. So the drugs were legitimized. They were written on prescription pads. They were dispensed in amber vials with child-proof caps. It looked like medicine. It was billed as health care. Freddie's primary enabler was a physician named Dr. William Kroger. Kroger was a specialist in internal medicine and hypnosis. He became Freddie's doctor. He saw the anxiety, he saw the insomnia. Instead of treating the root cause, the addiction, the pressure, the trauma, He treated the symptoms. He prescribed Quaaludes, hundreds of them. The records show a staggering volume of prescriptions. In the months leading up to the end, Freddie was obtaining prescriptions for Quaaludes in quantities that defied therapeutic logic. These were not doses for sleep. They were doses for oblivion. The network, NBC, was aware of Freddie's condition. You cannot hide an addiction of that magnitude on a working set. There were days when Freddie was late, days when he was slurring, days when he was manic. But Chico and the Man was the #1 show. It was generating millions in ad revenue. The calculation was cold and corporate. If they sent Freddie to rehab, production would stop, the money would stop, the time slot would go dark. So they managed the decline. They hired doctors to come to the set. They gave him vitamin shots to get him through the taping. They propped him up. They painted over the dark circles under his eyes. They edited around the slurred lines. As long as the finished product, the 22 minutes of laughter, was deliverable, the human cost was considered an acceptable operating expense. Freddie was not a person to NBC. He was a biological component of a profitable machine, a component that was wearing out, yes, but one that had to be kept running until the contract expired. In March 1976, there was a glimmer of light. Kathy gave birth to a son, Freddie Prinze Jr. For a moment, the reality of fatherhood pierced the chemical fog. Freddie was ecstatic. He loved the boy. He held him. He talked about the future. He talked about being the father he never had, present, loving, devoid of the crushing expectations his mother had placed on him. He wanted to be a good dad, but addiction is a jealous master. It does not share custody. The demands of the baby, the crying, the sleepless nights, clashed with Freddie's need for sedation. He couldn't handle the stress. He retreated further into the drugs. The Quaaludes made him clumsy. A man who cannot stand up straight cannot safely hold an infant. Kathy had to protect the child. She had to create a barrier between the baby and the father. This enraged Freddie. He felt rejected. He felt judged. He retreated to his side of the house, to his guns and his pills. The downward spiral accelerated in late 1976. The second season of Chico and the Man was airing, but the novelty was gone. The critics were turning. They said the show was repetitive. They said Freddie looked tired. He was tired. He was 22 years old, and he felt ancient. He began to exhibit behavior that was deeply disturbing. He started playing games with mortality. He would invite friends over. He would pull out a .357 Magnum. He would empty the cylinder. He would place one bullet on the table. He would spin the cylinder. He would put the gun to his head. Click. He would laugh. He would look at the horrified faces of his friends and laugh. "You guys are so scared," he would say. "It's just a game." But it wasn't a game. It was a rehearsal. He was testing the threshold. He was desensitizing himself to the mechanics of suicide. He was normalizing the feeling of cold steel against his temple. He told people he wouldn't live to see 30. He said it casually, like he was discussing the weather. He romanticized the 27 Club, though he was in a rush to beat even that deadline. He spoke of Lenny Bruce, the comedian who died of an overdose. He spoke of James Dean. He saw death not as an end, but as a career move, a way to freeze his legend before he burned out completely. He was also obsessed with the assassination of JFK. He bought bootleg copies of the Zapruder film. He watched it on a projector in his living room, over and over. Frame 313, the headshot, the pink mist. He studied it. He was fascinated by the fragility of the skull, the suddenness of the exit. This was not the behavior of a depressed man crying for help. This was the research of a man planning an event. By the winter of 1976, the marriage was dead. Kathy could no longer live in the war zone. The guns were everywhere. The drug use was open and excessive. Maria's hostility was constant. Kathy made the decision to leave. She took the baby. She moved out. This was the structural failure Freddie had feared, the abandonment. The silence in the house was absolute. Without Kathy and the baby, he was left alone with Maria and the employees. He spiraled. He filed for divorce, a preemptive strike to save face, but privately, he was devastated. He stalked Kathy. He called her incessantly. He threatened her. He threatened to kill himself if she didn't come back. Kathy got a restraining order. It was a legal wall. It barred him from seeing his son. Freddie Prinze, the prince of the barrio, the man who had the world at his feet, was now a man who couldn't walk through his own front door without a lawyer present. January 1977 arrived. The weather in Los Angeles was mild, but inside Freddie's head, it was a nuclear winter. He was sued by his former manager for breach of contract. A lawsuit meant depositions. It meant financial scrutiny. It meant stress. He was arrested for DUI, driving under the influence of Quaaludes. The police found him slumped over the wheel of his Corvette. The mugshot from that arrest shows a man who is already gone. The eyes are dead. The mustache is there. The handsome face is there. But the light is extinguished. NBC was worried. The legal trouble was bad press. But they didn't cancel the show. They just pushed the schedule. Keep taping. Keep laughing. Freddie moved into the Beverly Comstock Hotel. He couldn't stand the empty mansion. He needed a neutral space, a transition space. The hotel room became his bunker. He brought his clothes, he brought his drugs, and he brought his gun. The stage was set for the final act. The props were in place. The audience was waiting. The chemical cage he had built was now locked from the inside, and he had thrown away the key. He spent the final days of January in a haze. He visited a psychiatrist, but he lied to him. He told the doctor he was fine. He charmed him. He treated the therapy session like a talk show appearance. He got what he wanted, more prescriptions. He was smart enough to fool the doctors, but he wasn't smart enough to save himself. On January 26th, 2 days before the end, he visited his parents at the house. He was calm. He was affectionate. He told them he was going to fix everything. It was the calm of resolution. The decision had likely been made. The coin in his pocket had been flipped. He returned to the hotel. He ordered room service. He took the pills. He waited for the courage to catch up with the despair. The tragedy of Freddie Prinze is not that he wanted to die. It is that he didn't know how to live. He had been taught to perform, but he had never been taught to exist. Without the applause, he felt he had no value. And when the applause was drowned out by the noise of his own addiction, he decided to bring the curtain down on his own terms. By January 27, 1977, the Beverly Comstock Hotel was no longer a temporary residence for Freddie Prinze. It had become a command center for his unraveling. The suite, Room 25, was a study in isolation. Outside, the machinery of Hollywood continued to turn. Chico and the Man was still on the schedule. The writers were typing scripts for episodes Freddie would never film. The audience was waiting for the next laugh. Inside the room, however, the only schedule was chemical. Freddie's intake of Quaaludes had reached a level of toxicity that blurred the line between consciousness and coma. At these massive doses, the drug completely stripped away his survival instinct, leaving him in a numb, fearless haze. It dismantles the survival instinct. A man on enough Quaaludes does not fear death because he cannot conceptualize the future. He exists only in a slurred, numb present. On the evening of January 27th, Freddie received a visitor. It was his secretary, Carol. She brought him mail. She brought him updates on the divorce proceedings. The news was not good. The restraining order stood. Kathy was not coming back. The access to his son, Freddie Jr., remained blocked by legal walls. Freddie received this information with a strange, detached calm. The panic that had defined the previous weeks had evaporated, replaced by a flat, hollow resolve. He told Carol he was tired. He told her he just wanted to sleep, but he didn't sleep. He sat on the sofa, staring at the television, the volume low, the flickering light washing over his face. He picked up the phone. He began a series of calls that would later be reconstructed by police and biographers as a farewell tour. He called his mother, Maria. The conversation was brief. He did not scream. He did not cry. He told her he loved her. He thanked her for everything she had done. Maria, accustomed to her son's dramatic highs and lows, likely heard the fatigue in his voice, but missed the finality. She told him to rest. She told him everything would look better in the morning. She didn't know that for Freddie, the concept of mourning had become abstract. He called friends. He called Tony Orlando, the singer and variety show host. Orlando was one of the few people in the industry who saw Freddie as a little brother, not a meal ticket. Freddie sounded lucid but distant. He talked about how tired he was. He talked about the pain of losing his family. Orlando tried to rally him. He told him to hang in there. He told him they would get lunch. Freddie agreed, but his agreement was mechanical. It was the polite lie of a man who knows he won't be there for the appointment. He called John Travolta. Travolta was, at that moment, ascending to the same stratosphere of fame that Freddie occupied. He was the star of Welcome Back, Kotter. He understood the specific, crushing pressure of being a young icon. Freddie told him, "I love you, brother." Travolta sensed something was wrong. The tone was too heavy, too final. But before he could dig deeper, Freddie hung up. The calls were not cries for help. They were notifications. Freddie was closing his accounts. He was settling his emotional debts before checking out. As we witnessed at the beginning of our story, late that night, Dusty Snyder arrived. Snyder was Freddie's business manager. He was a pragmatic man, focused on contracts and finances, but he had become a de facto babysitter for the star. He came to the hotel because he was worried. The tone of Freddie's voice on the phone earlier had unsettled him. He found Freddie in the living room of the suite. Freddie was dressed in a white karate gi. He was barefoot. The room was dim. On the table, sitting next to an ashtray overflowing with cigarette butts, was the .32 caliber pistol. Snyder sat down. He tried to normalize the situation. He talked about business. He talked about the show. He tried to pull Freddie back into the world of obligations and future plans. Freddie wasn't listening. He was pacing. He was agitated. The calm of the earlier phone calls had fractured. The drugs were peaking. "I can't take it anymore, Dusty," Freddie said. "It's too much." He picked up the gun. Snyder froze. He had seen Freddie play with guns before. He had seen the Russian roulette games. But this felt different. There was no laughter. There was no audience of sycophants cheering him on. There was just the cold, hard reality of a desperate man holding a machine designed to kill. Snyder tried to talk him down. "Put the gun down, Freddie. Let's talk. Think about your son. Think about the baby." At the mention of his son, Freddie flinched. The pain of the separation was the trigger. "She won't let me see him," Freddie said. "She took him away." He sat on the sofa. He placed the gun on the coffee table. Snyder exhaled. He thought the crisis had passed. He thought he had talked him back from the edge. But Freddie wasn't done. He reached for a prescription pad. He scribbled something. A note. He handed it to Snyder. Snyder read it. It wasn't a suicide note in the traditional sense. It wasn't a long explanation. It was a release of liability. "I must end it. There's no hope left. I'll be at peace. No one is to blame. My decision totally." Snyder stared at the paper. The words were erratic, the handwriting shaky. This was real. This was a legal document drafted by a dying man. "Freddie, you can't do this," Snyder said. "You have everything to live for." Freddie smiled. It was a sad, broken smile. "I have nothing," he said. He picked up the gun again. Snyder lunged. He tried to grab the weapon, but Freddie was faster. Or perhaps Snyder was paralyzed by the sheer horror of the moment. Freddie put the barrel to his head. He didn't close his eyes. He looked at Snyder. He wanted a witness. He needed someone to verify that this was his choice, his action. "It's all over," he said. The sound of the gunshot was not loud. It was a pop, like a firecracker. Freddie's head snapped back. He slumped into the cushions of the sofa. The gun fell from his hand onto the carpet. Snyder screamed. He scrambled for the phone. He dialed the operator. "Get an ambulance." He shot himself. Freddie Prinze shot himself. The operator connected him to the paramedics. Snyder was shouting instructions, his voice cracking with panic. He looked at Freddie. Freddie was not dead. The bullet had entered the right temple. It had passed through the brain. But the vital centers, the brainstem, the heart, the lungs, were still functioning. He was breathing. It was a terrible, ragged sound, the snoring of a damaged brain trying to reset itself. Blood was pooling on the sofa. It soaked the white dye, turning it crimson. The paramedics arrived within minutes. They burst into the room with a gurney and medical bags. They saw the scene, the pills, the note, the gun, the blood. They knew who the victim was. They had watched him on TV. They went to work. They intubated him. They started an IV. They stabilized his neck. They loaded him onto the gurney and rushed him out of the hotel. The paparazzi were not there yet. The news hadn't broken. Freddie was wheeled through the lobby of the Beverly Comstock, past the empty front desk, out into the cool Los Angeles night. He was rushed to the UCLA Medical Center. It was the best trauma center in the city. The doctors there were used to gunshot wounds. They were used to celebrities. But this was different. This was the Clown Prince. He was wheeled into the emergency room. The trauma team swarmed him. They assessed the damage. It was catastrophic. The bullet had traversed both hemispheres of the brain. The swelling was immediate and massive. They moved him to the intensive care unit. They hooked him up to a ventilator. The machine took over the work of breathing. The heart monitor beeped a steady artificial rhythm. By dawn, the news had broken. The headlines were screaming. Freddie Prinze shoots self. Chico star critical. The hospital waiting room began to fill. Maria Prutzel arrived. She was hysterical. She demanded to see her son. She demanded that the doctors save him. She prayed loudly, invoking God, invoking saints. Kathy arrived. She was in shock. She had spoken to him hours before. She had refused to see him. Now she was seeing him with a bandage wrapped around his head, tubes coming out of his mouth. The guilt was a physical weight. The waiting room became a microcosm of Freddie's life. The two women who fought for him were now fighting over his dying body. Maria blamed Kathy. She screamed that Kathy had killed him by leaving. Kathy sat in silence, unable to process the accusation. The doctors called a meeting. The prognosis was grim. There was no brain activity. The swelling had cut off blood flow to the cerebral cortex. The person known as Freddie Prinze was gone. The body on the bed was a biological shell kept alive by electricity and compressed air. But Maria would not accept it. She insisted he was still there. She insisted on a miracle. He moved his hand, she would say. The doctors explained it was a reflex, a spinal twitch. It was not a sign of life. For 33 hours, the vigil continued. Tony Orlando came. He sat by the bed. He held Freddie's hand. He talked to him. He hoped that somewhere in the darkness, Freddie could hear him. Jack Albertson came, the old pro, the man who played the man. He looked at the boy he had tried to mentor. He saw the waste. He saw the tragedy. He wept. Outside the hospital, the media circus had set up camp. Cameras, reporters, fans holding candles. They wanted updates. They wanted a miracle. They wanted the sitcom ending where Chico wakes up with a bandage on his head and makes a joke. But this wasn't a sitcom. This was reality. And in reality, a .32 caliber bullet through the brain is irreversible. On January 29th, the doctors performed a final series of tests, an electroencephalogram, to measure brain waves. The line was flat. They presented the results to the family. There was no hope of recovery. Continuing life support was futile. A decision had to be made. Who had the legal right to pull the plug? Freddie and Kathy were separated, but they were still legally married. Kathy was the next of kin. The decision was hers. Maria fought it. She wanted to keep the machines on. She wanted to keep him warm. But the law was clear. Kathy, through her grief, made the decision. It was an act of mercy. She authorized the removal of life support. At 1 p.m. on January 29, 1977, the doctors turned off the ventilator. The room went quiet. The rhythmic hissing of the machine stopped. The only sound was the weeping of the women. Freddie's heart continued to beat on its own for a few minutes. Then it faltered. The rhythm broke. The line on the monitor went flat. A long, continuous tone filled the room. Freddie Prinze was pronounced dead. He was 22 years old. The body was prepared for transport. The autopsy would be performed by the Los Angeles County coroner. The results would confirm the obvious: death by self-inflicted gunshot wound. But the toxicology report would tell the deeper story. Freddie's blood was a chemical soup. It contained high levels of methaqualone. It contained traces of cocaine. It contained alcohol. He was legally intoxicated and chemically altered at the moment of death. This toxicology report became the centerpiece of the legal battle that followed. Normally, suicide voids a life insurance policy. Most policies have a clause: if the insured kills themselves within 2 years of taking out the policy, the company doesn't pay. Freddie had taken out substantial policies to protect his family. Maria and Kathy, united briefly by financial necessity, sued the insurance companies. They also sued Dr. William Kroger, the psychiatrist who had prescribed the Quaaludes. Their argument was audacious. They claimed that Freddie did not intend to kill himself. They argued that he was acting, that he was playing a prank, that he expected Snyder to wrestle the gun away, that he expected the safety to be on. They argued that the drugs had so impaired his judgment that he couldn't form the intent to commit suicide. Therefore, his death was an accident, a drug-induced mishap. It was a humiliating strategy. To win the money, they had to destroy his legacy. They had to paint him not as a tragic figure in pain, but as a reckless junkie who blew his head off by mistake. They brought in experts. They brought in witnesses who testified to his gun games. They painted a picture of a man who treated firearms like toys. The jury listened. In 1983, 6 years after his death, they reached a verdict. They agreed with the family. They ruled the death accidental. The insurance companies had to pay. Dr. Kroger settled out of court for malpractice. Legally, Freddie Prinze did not commit suicide. Legally, he died by accident. But history knows the truth: the note, the phone calls, the despair. The legal verdict was a financial maneuver, not a historical fact. The funeral was held at the Old North Church at Forest Lawn Memorial Park. It was a massive event. Thousands of fans lined the streets. The cast of Chico and the Man attended. Tony Orlando delivered the eulogy. He spoke of Freddie's light. He spoke of his speed. He spoke of the tragedy of a star that burns too bright. Maria Prutzel stood by the coffin. She had lost her purpose. Her little Jesus was gone. She would spend the rest of her life writing books about him, giving interviews, keeping the flame alive, but also controlling the narrative. She blamed Hollywood. She blamed Kathy. She blamed the drugs. She never blamed the pressure she had placed on him. Freddie was buried in a crypt at Forest Lawn. The plaque is simple, reading, "Beloved Son, Father," a final permanent reminder of the two roles he valued most, yet struggled to fulfill. Back at NBC, the executives were facing a crisis. Chico and the Man was their top show. They had contracts. They had ad slots sold. They made a decision that stands as a monument to corporate callousness. They decided to continue the show without Chico. They wrote Freddie out. They explained his absence vaguely. Chico went to visit his father in Mexico. Or Chico started his own business. They never said he died. They never let the characters grieve. Then they tried to replace him. They hired a child actor, Gabriel Melgar, to play a new character, Raul. They tried to recreate the dynamic, the grumpy old man and the spunky Latino kid. It was a disaster. The audience watched in horror. It was ghoulish. Jack Albertson looked miserable on screen. The chemistry was gone. The laughter was hollow. The ratings collapsed. The show limped along for one more season and was canceled in 1978. It was the only fitting end. You cannot replace a soul. The legacy of Freddie Prinze is complicated. He opened the door for Latino comedians. George Lopez, Paul Rodriguez, Gabriel Iglesias, they all cite him as the pioneer. He proved that a brown face could lead a primetime show. He proved that the Latino experience was an American experience. But his death is a warning label on the bottle of fame. He showed us that success is not a cure for trauma. He showed us that money cannot buy mental health. He showed us that if you give a child everything he wants before he knows who he is, you destroy him. Freddie Prinze Jr. grew up in the shadow of this tragedy. He was raised by his mother, Kathy. She took him out of Hollywood. She moved to New Mexico for a time. She shielded him from the madness. When he returned to Los Angeles as a young man, he carried his father's face, but not his father's demons. He entered the industry, but he kept his distance. He didn't do drugs. He didn't play games with guns. He treated acting as a job, not a religion. He became a star in his own right. But when the cameras turned off, he went home. He built a real life. He found the normality that his father had chased but never caught. In a way, the son finished the father's work. He achieved the balance that eluded Freddie Sr. He proved that the curse of the Prince ended with him. The hotel room at the Beverly Comstock is still there. It has been renovated many times. Different furniture, different carpet, but the space is the same. It is a quiet room. If you listen closely to the story of Freddie Prinze, you don't hear the laughter of the studio audience. You don't hear the catchphrase, "looking good." You hear the dial tone of a phone that no one answered. You hear the scratch of a pen on a prescription pad. You hear the spin of a cylinder, and you hear the silence that comes after the clown stops dancing. Freddie Prinze died for an audience of one. He wanted Dusty Snyder to see him go. He wanted to make sure the final scene was witnessed. Because for a man who lived his entire life in the reflection of others' eyes, dying alone would have been the ultimate failure. He got his wish. We are all witnesses now.